What's going on YouTube? Username Kite562 here with another Sherlock Holmes short story review, and it's of The Return of Sherlock Holmes. Now, this is the third short story collection out of 5, so sit back and relax and listen to what I have to say about all 13 short stories. So it'll be a long one. I'll also include chapters within this video, within the description below. So sit back, relax, and listen to what I have to say about the short stories featured in The Return of Sherlock Holmes. So please, feel free to leave a like, comment, subscribe if you enjoy the content on this channel, and thank you all who have recently subscribed. So let's get on with the video. Now, with the first story, it's The Adventures of the Empty House. And the plot for this story is John Watson is investigating the murder of Ronald Adair, which his murder happened with unforeseen circumstances. Now, for the first side note from my phone right here, since I'm always looking down on it, and this is where I take my notes when I read. For the first side note, Watson tries his hardest to use the observation skills he picked up from Sherlock. Even with the death of Mr. Holmes, everyone who was associated with him was in shambles, it seems, just according to the first page. And I have to say, the first notable quote that I wrote down is, "The Honorable Ronald Adair was the second son of Earl Maynooth, at that time governor of the Australian colonies." The Empty House, page 605, The Return of Sherlock Holmes. And as for the second side note for you all, Mr. Adair was a wealthy man and an avid card player. However, my question here is, who could have benefited from this man's death? And so, for my final thoughts on this story was very short, to the point, but it was a strong start to this short story collection. It details more on why the moment in the final problem story very well. I feel bad for the emotional anguish, though, Watson had to go through with the death of Sherlock Holmes, and then it turns out in this story, Sherlock Holmes faked his own death, so spoiler alert. But still, the emotional anguish Watson had to go through as a whole just really ticked me off as a reader, but I still enjoyed this short story collection. And so, let's get on with story number 2. The Adventures of the Norwood Builder. And the plot for this story starts off from the perspective of Sherlock Holmes. As Watson and Sherlock continue on their day, a man enters Sherlock's office, a man named John Hector McFarland. And he might have been the murderer of a Jonas Oldacre of Lower Norwood. Now, this story itself really interested me. So for my first side note, I feel like John could have been framed for the crime of the arson and murder of the builder Jonas Oldacre, but the question remains, who could it have been? And that's all I'll say for that first side note. And I have to say my favorite quote from this story has to be, "The community is certainly the gainer, and no one the loser, save the poor out-of-work specialist whose occupation has gone. With that man in the field, one's morning paper presented infinite possibilities." The Adventure of the Norwood Builder, page 619. And I have to say, for the second side note, could a woman that Mr. Oldacre had relations with be the culprit and framed Mr. McFarland for the crimes? That was the question I had here, but, read the story to find out. And so, for my final thoughts on The Adventure of the Norwood Builder, a story that was really well written, in my opinion, with its pace and different changes. This story in general reminded me of the Naval Treaty, and a good chunk of the stories featured in The Return of Sherlock Holmes really reminded me of the Naval Treaty as a whole. And so, while combining some moments from the Reigate Squires short story, while also maintaining its own sense of individuality, which I thought was interesting, like, the stories from The Return of Sherlock Holmes kind of blended itself from the previous short story collection, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, which I'll leave a link up here if you want to watch the playlist. So, let's get on with story number 3. The Adventures of the Dancing Men. So for the plot of The Adventures of the Dancing Men, Sherlock and Watson help their client, Hilton Cubitt of Ridingthorpe Manor, wants Sherlock Holmes and Watson to investigate a mysterious drawing on a crumpled piece of paper, and it's like a drawing of mysterious little stickmen. Almost like cave drawings or like Mayan stick figure drawings in a way is the best way I can describe it. Or even Pokemon's unknown creatures or something around those lines is the best way I can describe it with how the book depicted it. And I'll also leave a link to the book itself up here. So apparently these strange little stickmens on this crumpled piece of paper has Mr. Cubitt in a shock from this. And for my first side note, from the very first pair of pages, the story kind of reminds me of the 5 orange piths, with the weird letters of the piths being sent in the envelope and the sender being from the KKK, which was absolutely shocking for that story. Excuse me. And so for my final thoughts on this story, it wasn't very gripping in my eyes. However, I think this story tried to be like the 5 orange piths, but it didn't pan out well, so I'll let you read it for yourself. So let's get on with story number 4. The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist. For Miss Violet Smith is the daughter of James Smith, the conductor of the old Imperial Theater. Violet also wants to figure out about her uncle Ralph Smith, who hasn't been seen for 25 years, it seems. And so, for the first side note, the story gives me the feeling that James Smith attracted quite a lot of suspicious people in his time being alive. Cyril Morton, who's an electrical engineer who was supposed to be married to Violet by the end of the summer, according to page 652. And so, for the second side note, there's also Mr. Woodley, who seems to be a pretty awful person to be around, according to page 653. I mean, this guy was just absolutely barbaric and just all around toxic as a whole, as a human being. Like, how much lower can you get with this guy? And so, for my final thoughts on this, it was a solid thriller of a short story. Although it was kind of predictable in my eyes, I still enjoyed it. The build of each part on every page, along with the final reveal scenes and the action on the final few pages, was an absolute treat for me. And so, let's get on with story number 5. The Adventures of the Priory School. And so, the plot is, Dr. Thorncroft Huxtable wants Sherlock and Watson to investigate the sudden abduction of the Duke of Holderness's only son, who's a student at the Priory School, which Dr. Huxtable is the principal of. And so, for my first side note, when the Duke's son arrived on May 1st to start the summer semester at the Priory School, the principal could not notice the boy wasn't too thrilled about his home life. Could the Duke have remarried another woman when the mother had passed away before his son was born? Or the Duke was consumed by his duties, the man didn't have the time to be a proper father to his son? This is my question after reading pages 664 and 665 here. Like, a child's bond with their father is the utmost importance, in my opinion, and it's just a really important moments in one's life to have a bond with their father. Okay, so for my second side note is that who could have kidnapped the Duke's son in the first place? Who could benefit of this situation that happened to Lord Saltire, which is the Duke's son's name? I also love the descriptions of the scenes unfolding on pages 673 and 674, as Sherlock and Watson continue their investigation of the Priory School short story. And so my final thoughts, It was enjoyable and one of my favorites from this short story collection. I'll admit, though, the solution was kind of predictable again. Like a good chunk of these stories in my eyes were predictable on the first half, but the second half, whew! And again, it was enjoyable and one of my favorites from this short story collection. I'll admit, though, the solution was kind of predictable, but kind of wasn't, if that makes any sense to you all here. So let's get on with story number 6. The Adventures of Black Peter. So the plot for this story is the client, Stanley Hopkins, which he's another detective of Sherlock Holmes, kind of like a buddy, not as much of a rival, so to speak, just like a chill brother kind of character in my eyes. It's how I read him. So the plot is, again, the client, Stanley Hopkins, wants Sherlock and Watson to investigate the death of Captain Peter Carey, a man 50 years old. However, within a week, Peter suddenly passed away of unforeseen circumstances. And so, for the first side note, Peter was a very skilled sea captain and had several successful sea voyages. However, in 1884, Peter decided to retire in his home of Woodsman Lees, and it's close to Forest Row, within Sussex, at least according to page 685. So my question here that I wrote down here on my notes on my phone, who could benefit from this successful man's death? Surely people gained some enemies over the years. I mean, with all those sea adventures, you're bound to have some sort of hellish encounter with somebody. And so for side note number 2, unfortunately on page 686, Peter was an alcoholic, it seems, a raging one at that, towards his wife and daughter and 2 servants. And Peter's daughter is 20 years old. I don't know why the book said that, but it just did, so I wrote it down. So, Black Peter was a trade name given to Mr. Carey when he was an active captain in the trade, with a horrible dark sense of humor, it seems, especially when he's drunk. And so, for my second question, could his own family plotted a plan with some of the people Mr. Carey crossed paths with? And when he was an active captain. That's my theory here. Just thinking out theories and thoughts. I mean, I know these Sherlock stories aren't meant to be solved, but I just enjoy trying to make theories and how it could have been pieced together. And so my favorite quote here is, "And there, in the middle of it, was the man himself, his face twisted like a lost soul in torment, and his great brittled beard stuck upwards in his agony." The Adventures of Black Peter, page 687. And so my final thoughts, it was a really amazingly written whodunit story. I'm also glad my conclusion was incorrect. However, I wish this short story was a novel instead of just a short story, telling about Black Peter's adventures as an active captain, sailing the seas. I just think that would be a really enjoyable experience, in my opinion. That would have been great. That would have made this story really amazing, in my opinion. So let's get on with story number 7. The Adventures of Charles Augustus Milverton. And so for my only note of this story, it was a very quick and to the point story, but I really hated Charles Augustus Milverton. I mean, he really reminded me of the guy, Junya Kineshiro from Persona 5, you know, the fat dude who looked like Charles Lee Ray before he put his soul into the good guy doll. That's the idea I get from here, and he also looked like Baxter Stockman's fly form from the TMNT series of the 80s when you're fighting his boss. So, slight spoilers for Persona 5 Royal. Great game, by the way. Anyway, back to the book. So, for the next short story, The Adventure of the 6 Napoleons. So the plot for this story is, Sherlock and Watson investigate a burglary of a Miss Morse Hudson, a very skilled bust sculptor who was located in Kennington Road. And for my final thoughts, as with the previous story, as I said, give this one a read. I don't want to delve too deep in it because I feel like I'd spoil it. And same for the other one, The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton. Really shitty character, but, give the story a read, because if I were to analyze it, I would have ruined the experience for new readers. So I really don't want to do that. So, story number 9. The Adventures of the Three Students. So for the plot of this story, Sherlock and Watson help a college lecturer and tutor, Hilton Soames, Soames. I don't know why my phone keeps on auto-correcting me all the time. It was really annoying, so I just spelt it differently just to shut up my phone. So again, the plot is Sherlock and Watson help a college lecturer and tutor, Hilton Soames, which, according to his statement, is that Mr. Soames had a very painful incident happen to him at St. Luke's College. Mr. Soames thinks that one of the students, or more, could have stolen the answer key to the exams, it seems. And now, this was like the Greek translation portion of the test, if I'm remembering correctly. So, for the first side note, according to page 723, one slip was on the floor, another was at the side table near the window. However, the final paper was exactly where Mr. Soames left it. So who could have done it? So I put down for another part of side note 1, Mr. Soames' butler is named Bannister, who seemed very forgetful on this day. Could Bannister have a family member attending the college without Mr. Soames' knowledge? That was my question here as I was reading. I'm just like, what could it mean? Huh? What are you hiding, dude? So for the second side note, so there are 3 students as suspect. Gilchrist, a very athletic student whom Mr. S. least suspects the most, and then suspect number 2, Dawlet Ross, which Greek wasn't his greatest subject, but he's confident in his other subjects. Dawlet is very steady and methodical. And so for suspect number 3, Miles McLaren, a brilliant mind with lots of untapped potential, but from my perspective, it seems that Mr. McLaren didn't find the curriculum too challenging at St. Luke's College, since he's also has a rebellious streak in this story. That's how I interpret it. But all in all, this was a really solid story. So my theory here is that these 3 students were targeted by the real culprit, which could have been a relative of Mr. Bannister's, or the 3 students assumed of the crime are working together, maximizing their best traits. So my final thoughts on this story: I was kind of right and kind of wrong on this one. A solid to the point story. It was a really relaxing experience. Like, I really loved how the school was described, and it was really elegantly. Like, all the students had their own dorms, and it was just really beautifully written as a whole. So, story number 10. The Adventure of the Golden Pince-Nez. It seems that Stanley Hopkins is investigating the current occupants of a place called Yoxley Old Place. There was a murder that took place of Willoughby Smith, who apparently was killed in Professor Quorum's study. Who could have wanted this young man dead? So for my first side note, could a former colleague wanted Mr. Smith's job as Mr. Quorum's writer, since Mr. Quorum was disabled and was mostly bedridden, and he couldn't really write, so he had Mr. Smith be his, diction, writer and whatnot, write down notes for him by hand. So, for side note number 2, could Mr. Coram be faking his disability? Because as I looked at the diagram featured in this book of this story, there had to be something more here to my eyes. But as I said, for the second side note, could Mr. Coram be faking his disability as a way for him to navigate around the house unnoticed? That could be why Mr. Smith was so shocked moments before his death. I mean, how would you feel if somebody who was disabled for years suddenly was able to be active or, have a surge of rage and energy just wanting to kill you, Just, that was my theory, but alas, I was wrong. So, that could be why Mr. Smith was so shocked moments before his demise. The last words that he spoke was, "It was she." Were the last words that Mr. Smith spoke before he succumbed to his neck injury from a wax sealing knife, according to page 736. And so, for my final thoughts of this story, it was very enjoyable and cozy horror story, like a Darcy Coates book. So, like with the Adventure of Black Peter short story, I wish this one was a fleshed out to a full novel, in my opinion, because that's how much I really enjoyed this story of the adventure of the Golden Pince-Nez, or whatever you want to call it. So, story 11. The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter. So the plot for this story is a Mr. Cyril Overton asks frantically for Sherlock Holmes to help in finding his missing teammate, Godfrey Staunton. What could have caused Mr. Staunton to disappear? As for the first side note that I written down, Mr. Overton is the skipper of the rugger team, so I assume that means like rugby or some sort of sport of the whole, for Cambridge University. Even before Godfrey went missing, he was a pale and sickly, but Godfrey said he was all right, according to page 750. And that's for my first side. Oh, my second side note is that Godfrey is an orphan, revealed on page 751, and his only living relative is a rich uncle named Lord Mount James, which he's a curmudgeonly asshole, so sorry to burst your bubble on that one. So a little bit of a cliche here. And on top of that, Godfrey would spend the least amount of time with him as much as possible because Lord Mount James wouldn't even give Godfrey a penny and would rather see him squalor around for money rather than just benefit from his riches. But again, Godfrey is the only heir to Lord Mount James. So my question here is, could have Godfrey hired a person to send him a note or put something in his drink to make him slightly sick, but not to the point to where it kills him, just so he can retire to his room unnoticed, and then the bellhop would send Godfrey the note? So then, after Godfrey recovers, he can finally confront his uncle and presumably murder him. Since Lord Mount James is rich and Godfrey is the only heir to James's estate, that's what my mind was adding up to when I was reading this story. And so for side note number 3, the note saying, "Stand by us for God's sake," and it was ending on an exclamation point, is what the telegram says before Godfrey disappeared. Could Godfrey be pressured by his uncle's family to keep up a public image of a star rugby player, or could Lord Mount James be kind of vicariously living through his nephew, Godfrey, and then Godfrey Staunton just absolutely hated it over the years? I mean, think about it. It all adds up as a whole. And he just had the title of the three-quarter position. I assume that's like a quarterback in rugger terms. Let me know down in the comments below. Sorry about that. And again, that document was shown on page 753. And so for my final thoughts on this story, It was a strong and wonderful short story. I have to say, it made me feel a lot of sympathy for Godfrey Staunton. And I also have to say for this story, go read it if you want to figure out the story as a whole. Really quite enjoyable. And so let's get on with story number 12. The Adventure of the Abbey Grange. The plot of this story is that Sherlock and Watson and Inspector Stanley Hopkins investigate a murder of a man named Sir Eustace Brackenstall, a wealthy man struck down with a fire poker, it seems. So, for my first side note, apparently the three detectives suspect a trio of burglars responsible for this tragedy, a father and his two sons. However, could have Lady Brackenstall have hired the trio to kill the man? She stated their marriage was not a happy one on page 765. Sounds like a motive to me. Motive for murder! Also, the trio was known as the Three Randalls, it seems, and they're from Lewisham, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And so for side note number 2, Eustace was a raving drunkard, according to his wife. In my opinion, that is another motive on Lady Brackenstall's part. But could she have threatened to, or convinced the housemaid Teresa to do the deed of killing Mr. Brackenstall, since she slept above Lady Brackenstall's room? That's a really good question I have for this story, you know. And I have to say a notable quote is that he had evidently been in his bed when the alarm had broken out, for he wore a foppish embroidered nightshirt, and his bare feet projected from his trousers. His head was horribly injured, and the whole room bore witness to the savage ferocity of the blow which struck him down. The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, page 767. And my final thoughts on this story is, the story surprised me with its ending. Even though I didn't correctly guess the outcome, I feel like this story could have been connected to the adventures of Black Peter in a way. So it was a really intriguing surprise, but still kind of predictable, but again, enjoyable with its wonderful descriptions of the environment as a whole. And plus, with the book showing you like descriptions of the layout of some investigative areas, it's really amazing in my opinion. And so for the final story, story 13, The Adventure of the Second Staying. So for the plot of this one, Sherlock and Watson help a man named Trelawney Hope. Apparently Mr. Hope lost a document of great importance at 8 a.m. in the morning. This couldn't have been a simple case of misplacing something, but Mr. Hope and the Baker Street duo, being Sherlock and Watson, have to keep this under wraps to prevent mass panic from the public of Europe and of Britain, of course. And I have to say, I really wish I knew what was in those documents that Mr. Hope is guarding, but I can understand secrecy, so I can respect that. So for my first side note, Mr. Hope left the box open when he was getting ready for dinner last night. And it was at like 7:30. And he and his wife are both light sleepers, and he saw the document before he went to dinner. So could have a maid picked it up and give it to a nefarious person, or is this situation going to be similar to the Naval Treaty short story? Was my question in theory here. And so for the second side note, Eduardo Lucas had now been murdered according to page 782 and 783. Apparently the murder weapon was a carved Indian dagger. My question here is, could one of his done the deed, or one of their relatives perhaps? Who knows? Again, I wanted to keep this review of the final short story brief, but in conclusion to this collection, some of the stories were a hit or miss for me. However, the later half of the stories, like The Adventures of Black Peter and The Adventures of the Abbey Grange, this is a strong 8.3 out of 10 for a short story collection for me. I'm glad some of the stories threw me off, though. So, yeah, that's my adventures of the Return of Sherlock Holmes short story collections. And thank you all who have subscribed to my channel recently. It really means a lot. So, and thank you all for the comments. I also try to respond to as many comments as I can. And I also have a Discord for this channel, so feel free to join that as well if you'd like to know what goes on behind the scenes for my video making process. So anyway, this is Kite562 signing out, and as always, I hope you have a wonderful day, everybody. Later.